on this? Wonderful. And we are going to use the Q&A section of Zoom tonight. So if you've got questions for our presenters this evening, please go ahead and use the Q&A option. That should be at the bottom of your screen. And if we don't get to your question, please feel free to email us at info@anjac.org. Or if you have a question that's unrelated to tonight's webinar, also please email us at info@anjac.org. So for those of you who I don't yet know, my name is Jennifer Coffey, and I have the pleasure of serving as ANJAC's Executive Director. And this evening, I am joined by Elizabeth Ritter, ANJAC's Deputy Director, and Sheila Baker-Grajal, our Resource Center Manager. We also have several just brilliant presenters tonight and incredibly dedicated public servants. So I'm thrilled to bring you this program tonight. For those of you who don't know ANJAC, I'm sure most of you do, you know that our mission is to serve you. Our number one priority is to work with you, our environmental commissioners, on what is most important to you. We work at both the local and the state level. We promote the issues that you see at the municipal level to the state level with the DEP, the governor's office, and the legislature to try to get statewide engagement on those issues. And that's why we're here this evening. We also work our mission by engaging in diverse and inclusive practices through our leadership, partnership, and education, because we are working to create a more equitable New Jersey with you as our partners. We thank you for your membership. If you are not sure if you are a member of ANJAC, if your municipality is a member, then you can go ahead and email us at info@anjac.org. And please check out the membership section of our website. As a member, you receive our quarterly ANJAC report. That's our magazine that reports on all of the updates that are happening at the state level regarding climate change and flood hazard and the conversion to clean energy and the issues that we hear from you. We also try to report on the successes that we see around the state that ECs have accomplished, as well as lessons learned, because it's important to learn from what worked as well as what's not working as well. Because our priority is you, we want to hear from you. So if you can go ahead and use the app on your phone to click on this QR code, or scan this QR code, we would like to hear from you just a few quick questions about what is most important to your environmental commission and your municipality, and that will help us to tailor future ANJAC reports, future resources, and webinars. And we also want to thank you for your individual donations. ANJAC is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we cannot do the work that we are doing tonight and throughout the year without your support. So if you find this program valuable to you and your municipality, we ask that if you can and when you can, you consider giving to ANJAC. All the donations that we receive at the $50 level or more will receive copies of our ANJAC report mailed directly to you. So again, thank you for your donations, for your membership. We greatly support it. And we ask that you stay in touch with us. This program, as all of our virtual programs, are on YouTube at our @ANJAC Views channel, as well as we provide links on Facebook and Instagram, updates of what's happening around the state and at the state level. So please do follow us on social media and check out our YouTube channel as well. So before I introduce our first speaker this evening, I do want to take a moment and recognize the passing of a state leader, but really a public servant. Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver passed away today. We were informed this morning. She has spent decades serving the state of New Jersey and really the people of New Jersey. She was the first Black speaker of our assembly in New Jersey. She is our lieutenant governor, and she had a great commitment to our municipalities through her service at the Department of Community Affairs. So I would just ask that with this sudden passing and this loss for New Jersey, and most particularly loss for her family and her loved ones, that we take a moment and keep them in our thoughts and our heart and our prayers. So with that, I would like us to pick up the mantle of continuing to serve New Jersey and the great people who live here in this state, as Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver had done for decades, as we continue forward this morning in talking about some monumental changes to regulations regarding flood hazard to better protect the people who live in this great state. And I say this is monumental because what we're about to talk about is the first time in this country of ours that we are using climate change, climate modeling data to regulate land use. Now, that may sound like common sense, because I personally think it is. I think we all would agree to that. But it is the first time that we have coded in regulation using climate modeling. So this is exciting. There are other states who are looking at New Jersey and are eager to learn about what we have done and how they can apply it to their state. So with that, I want to introduce not only a brilliant public servant and really just phenomenally dedicated person, but also my good friend, Vince Mazzei, who in November of 2022 was appointed as the New Jersey State Floodplain Administrator after serving for 2.5 years as DEP's Assistant Commissioner for Watershed and Land Management. Vince started his career at DEP after graduating from Stevens Institute of Technology with a bachelor's in civil engineering in 1988. Known throughout New Jersey as an expert in flood risk analysis and mitigation, Vince is a licensed professional engineer who has served the people of New Jersey and their environment for over 35 years. He has worked to support environmentally responsible planning, design, construction of thousands of development infrastructure projects throughout New Jersey. Vince is the author of New Jersey's Flood Hazard Area Act control rules, which are the most stringent statewide flood hazard area and stream corridor protection regulations in the nation, and has a leading role in the development of NJ Pact, which is protecting against climate threats, our transformative regulatory reform initiative. Vince was named the 2018 Government Engineer of the Year by the American Society of Civil Engineers, North Jersey branch, and the 2016 Civil Engineer of the Year by the American Society of Civil Engineers, Central New Jersey branch, and is the 2-time recipient of the State of New Jersey Teamwork and Partnership Award. So Vince, I want to turn it over to you because I know you have a lot to say. I want to thank you for all of your work on this. And just as a quick aside, I remember it has to have been 15 years ago at this point where we had dinner and there was a recent iteration of flood rules that you wrote with lots of support from the department that came out. And we were sitting there just racking our brains saying, how do we build a crystal ball to see forward? How do we incorporate climate change? Because we're not there yet. This is 15 years ago. How do we build the crystal ball to know what's going to happen? So I'm thrilled. I'm going to shush now to have you talk about the crystal ball that you've built and how this rule really is going to save lives. And so I'm thrilled to have so many people here. We've got 73 now, and they're going to be on task with getting their municipalities in line to make sure that we're in compliance with these rules. So take it away, Vince. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Jen. Really, really appreciate that. Let's see, first of all, if I can get the PowerPoint working. Can you see that screen?
Coming in. Yep, we've got it.
Awesome.
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that intro. And, you know, it really is exciting because sometimes when I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time with water. I would just play in streams, and we had a little pond in our backyard. And if you had told me when I was a kid that when I grew up, I was going to get to work for the state protecting all these surface waters and making sure that the water quality was good and that people were protected, that would have been the best thing you could have told me as a kid. So, you know, I'm just very thankful that I had this opportunity, and I'm thankful to speak to you all. And if I forget to tell you at the end, because I'm not sure in the PowerPoint if I put my email address, I'll read it to you later. But if you have any questions, because if you're like me, about an hour after the presentation's over or 2 o'clock in the morning or something, you'll think, oh, I should have asked this question and I didn't, I forgot to. That's okay, because you can email me and I'm happy to answer your questions. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about why we did what we did, and how it's working and what the rules look like. And I'm going to start with good news. The good news is that we have a lot of water in New Jersey. We have a lot of We have an abundance of surface waters, and that's a fantastic resource. And this is a large reason why the area was settled by the Europeans when they came over. And as a result, though, most of our town centers, probably every town in the state, has some kind of stream going through it, because that's where settlements were made on water, because they were the navigable, they were the means of transportation and commerce and source of life. So the downside of that, though, is that means that there's a whole lot of development that has been here for a very long time that was done without taking into account the fact that there's a flood hazard, right? There's a hazard of flooding. And how do we even know whether we have a flood hazard, right? How do you know if you're looking at your home or a business or a road that you're driving on that there's a flood risk? And here's the main problem, right? Flood risk is generally measured by what's happened in the past. We look at past rainfall events and we project into the future how often we should get extreme precipitation at a given site, or how often it would flood at a site. And that's great if there isn't climate change, but with a changing climate and with increases in precipitation and increases in intensity, we're seeing more and more of our 100-year floods and other things, which we'll talk about today, happening much more frequently than they did in the past. And so people don't really have a good means, if you're just looking at flood insurance rate maps by FEMA, as to what the flood risk is. And if you look at most flood maps, they were based on data that was collected decades ago, and it was developed for flood insurance. So it's really not an accurate predictor of today's flood risk at all. And it's certainly not a sound methodology for predicting future flood risk because of climate change, because none of the mapping that we have takes into account climate change. Now, this is essential because in order for people to be safe and for us to have ongoing commerce and transportation and everything else that we need in our lives, you have to be aware of your flood risks. And often people are in a flood zone and they don't know it. And so they buy, they rent, they occupy buildings, they develop property, and they're not really aware that they're at risk because they're outside of that line on the map. So even though mapping is a great place to start to begin to assess those risks, flooding, as we've seen over and over again, often exceeds mapped floodplain limits. And the flood doesn't know that it's supposed to stop at that line on the map. And I've had this conversation with almost everybody in my family who lives anywhere near a stream or river, that they should get flood insurance, even though they're outside the line of the map, because the water may not stop there. Quick snapshot of New Jersey and some of the things that we've done in the past. Almost 9.3 million people, most densely populated state in the country. We estimated that about 16% of the land area in the state lies within a flood hazard area. So that means that the population in the flood hazard area is probably maybe almost twice as much. According to the 2019 State Hazard Mitigation Plan, we've got hundreds of billions of dollars at risk. We've got 3 million properties that are not covered by an insurance policy for flooding. We've got thousands of repetitive loss properties, 73% of which are single family homes. So this means homes that are flooded or buildings that are flooded over and over again. Severe repetitive loss, critical facilities, 1,700 critical facilities and infrastructure located in that 1% flood hazard area. And you'll see that term come up a lot. 1% is what we call the 100-year storm, right? Because it's a storm that it's a flood that has a 1% probability of happening in any given year. Billions of dollars in obligations and post-disaster grants over the last 3 decades. And we have the highest foreclosure rate in the nation. So what ends up happening, and we saw this over and over again with our flood events, is that people are flooded, they might not have flood insurance, and they go bankrupt and they lose their homes. And when you put all this together, it's not surprising that as far back as 2004, FEMA said that flooding is our #1 natural hazard in New Jersey. Now, we've done a lot in New Jersey to try to combat this and address this. The program that we operate in was actually started in 1929, because even back then there was a recognition that if you obstruct channels or you build bridges and dams and things and they're not correctly done, then you can cause flooding. We already regulated a flood that was bigger than FEMA's flood, because we knew as far back as 1974 that development was making flooding get worse. And On top of that, we have a foot of freeboard, which means that if you figure out what your flood elevation is, you have to go a foot higher for your roads and your buildings. We have 0% net fill or 0% flood storage displacement, which basically means if you can imagine a floodplain is like a bathtub full of water. If you step into a bathtub, your foot displaces some of that water. So that means the water's got to go somewhere else. So if I fill in my property in the floodplain and you live across the stream, it's going to flood you worse. So we have a law in the New Jersey that says 0%. If you fill any floodplain, you've got to create an equal volume of flood storage. No other state has anything like that. We make sure that buildings have what we call dry access during flood events, hospitals, schools, townhouses, that there's a way to get in and out during a flood. We've got very progressive statewide stormwater management policies, progressive stream corridor protection standards through our riparian zone standards. But despite all above, the damage due to flooding in New Jersey continues to increase annually. And if you put it all together, okay, we're the most densely populated state, chronic flooding issues dating back as long as we've recorded history. 16% of the state, much more of the population lying in a flood hazard area, enormous development pressure. Development itself can increase flooding if it's not regulated. And then just throw on top of that climate change. That's an unsustainable condition unless we step in and take some bold action and make changes. And that's what we've done here. Governor Murphy signed an executive order that then encouraged then Commissioner McCabe to sign an administrative order that directed the DEP to integrate climate change considerations, including sea level rise and chronic flooding, into its regulatory and permitting programs. So about 3 years ago, we started down this journey of looking at our flood hazard rules, our stormwater rules, our coastal zone management rules, our freshwater wetlands rules, to see how we can make them responsive to climate change, to how we can regulate things, not just for today's conditions, but for the conditions in the future that unfortunately we're going to inherit. Now, as you know, as the atmosphere is warmer, it can hold more water. And that means there's an increase in potential of energy in the atmosphere and therefore increase in potential for the intensity of storm events. And some studies suggested that by the end of the century, that heavy storm events can be could happen as much as 2 to 5 times more often than they did in the previous century. And I don't have to remind anyone of all the major flooding events that hit New Jersey just in this century alone. So let's make things worse before we make things better. I'm going to even give you some more news. When someone's designing a stormwater management system, they weren't until 2 weeks ago when we adopted this rule. They weren't designing the stormwater management systems for today's storm, much less for the future storms. They weren't even doing it for today's storms. They were designing it for data that was only updated through 1999. So we have seen changes since 1999, and I'm going to explain a study that we partnered with that identified what those changes were. So all these things that we do that guide state policy and our rules, they don't accurately reflect even what's happening today for current precipitation. And here's the kind of the core of the study that we did. So in 21, we partnered with NOAA, and we released a study that did 2 things. It looked at, well, what's happened since 1999 to our storm events, and what do we anticipate will happen through the end of the century? Because a road or a building or a bridge is likely still going to be here in 75 years, and that's the end of the century. So we want to ensure that buildings, roads, infrastructure, things that people are relying on to get them safely home or to be in their homes is safe, not just for today, but for future conditions. And the numbers that we found, it was staggering, right? Since 1999, you can see the 100-year storm in some counties has increased as much as 15% in just a 20-year period. And if you project that to the end of the century based on the modeling that we have, and this is all New Jersey specific data, so we have a high confidence in the data, that 100-year storms in some counties can be as much as 50% more by the end of the century. So if a 100-year storm event today is 8 inches of rain, that means it's going to be 12 inches of rain by the end of the century. So obviously more rain means more stormwater runoff, because that means more water hitting the ground. And more runoff means more riverine flow, because the water is now getting to our rivers to be conveyed to the ocean. So more water in the rivers means higher flood elevations, which means more people at risk. So our infrastructure that we have and our stormwater management systems that we have today can barely hold on to the storm events that we're having. And we see it over and over again now, where you have flash flooding, where you have storm events that overwhelm the storm sewer systems, and the road becomes the conduit for floodwaters. And so we're seeing increased depths of flooding along our riverine systems, and of course, unfortunately, increased risk to life and to property. So we were down this path looking at the data and trying to decide how best to approach it and incorporate it into our rules when Ida hit. Now, the rules that we adopted are not because of Ida, but Ida was a sad example of what, unfortunately, we're likely to see much more of over as decades continue. So September 1st, 2021, we had record rainfalls across good portions of the state. Newark experienced its highest 1 hour rainfall total ever recorded. There were parts of the state, including where I live in Hunterdon County, that got over 10 inches of rainfall within a couple hour period. So it was absolutely incredible to see what happened as a result. Now, I didn't take this picture. It's kind of small because it's blurry, but this is from the parking lot of the ShopRite in Flemington on Route 202. And you can see there's about 3 feet of water, 2 or 3 feet of water in the parking lot, about 3 feet of water in Route 202. There is no stream or river or lake or anything anywhere near here. This is all runoff from Flemington that couldn't be conveyed to streams because their storm sewer systems were overwhelmed. And Route 202 became a river. And several people died on Route 202 because the water came so fast that they couldn't get out of their cars in time and they were swept away. So we said, well, let's take a look at Ida and compare the flood elevations that we saw for Ida with what we regulate today. In other words, are people safe if a storm like this happens again? Are they going to be safe, or are we designed to a standard that's antiquated based on old data? And previous to the rulemaking, we looked at 2 sets of maps. We looked at state maps because the DEP has mapped some of the larger floodplains in the state, and that's based on a bigger flood than the 100-year. And then FEMA's got their 100-year flood. So what we would do is we would say, well, the flood's always going to be at least a foot higher than FEMA. We've been doing that for a long time. But what we found is that by looking at the case studies that I'm going to show you a couple, that the flooding was actually about 3 feet above FEMA's 100-year in all the places that we looked, which is 2 feet higher than what we previously regulated. So that means that people who invested in properties and built their homes thinking that they were elevated enough were not safe. And even in my own neighborhood, we saw a tragedy occur. We saw flooding happen to an unprecedented amount. So here's a couple snapshots that kind of show you where we are. Raritan River in Bound Brook, there's a U.S. Geological Service data point there. There's a gauge that measures flow. And you can see that Ida in the top left corner there crested at the same elevation as Floyd did in 1999. Now, Floyd was a hurricane. It was a widespread. Yet Ida, this surgical kind of localized remnants of a tropical storm, we reached flooding that was equivalent to that in 1999. And what's even worse is that at this location, we've had 3 500-year floods in the last 24 years since 1999. So if you're having 3 500-year floods, a flood that should happen statistically once every 500 years in a 24-year period, then that right there shows you that there's something wrong with the analysis, the statistics that have brought us to this point. And here's kind of how it hits the ground, and you can kind of see practically what happens. So here's Millstone River at Manville, and this is before Ida. And this is the same spot during Ida. Now you can see this white building that's shaped like a 7 in the corner as a reference point. I tried the best that I could to match up the flood maps to see, well, how did the flooding here comport with the mapping that we have? And you can see this entire neighborhood of homes here was all flooded, and there was severe damage there. But if you look at the flood map, all of the homes in the middle here were not even mapped in a floodplain. None of these people were required by anybody to have insurance. And unless you have a lender that requires you to have flood insurance, you don't have it. And a lot of people we saw this unfortunately with Sandy, is once they pay off their mortgage, they drop their flood insurance because they say, well, it hasn't flooded in decades. I can't afford it. I'm on a fixed income. And then when the flood comes, there's absolutely no protection. So we're trying to protect not just the people in the map flood zones, but the people outside the map flood zones. Now, here's a local example. This is a Google Maps picture of the road I live on before Ida, about a half a mile from my house, right? This is pre-Ida. This is the same spot picture that I took post-Ida. The Wickeecheokee Creek, Category 1 water, decided it wanted to be where the road was, and it moved about 100 feet to the right and took out about 900 feet of the road. So it's ironic because here I've been working for floodplain management my entire career, and my house and the road in front of my house are not in a flood zone. It never occurred to me that both ends of my road were in a flood zone and could get destroyed, and that's what happened. So our house was inaccessible for about 3 days during Ida. So that means if we had a medical emergency, if we needed to get more, fuel for our generator or anything, we were trapped. And my neighbors fared even worse than we did. So that is unfortunately what we're likely to see more and more of. Okay, so what's the state of New Jersey going to do about this? Well, we proposed back in December what we call the Inland Flood Protection Rule, and that was adopted just 2 weeks ago yesterday. And this rule, as Jen mentioned, is the first statewide rule that incorporates future projections based on climate change for a regulatory purpose. So it opened up 2 of our rules, the Stormwater Management Rules and our Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules. And here are some key points. For stormwater, it requires that stormwater systems that are being installed today are not only designed to manage today's runoff, adjusted from 1999, but also for future anticipated storms. So that way the storm systems can continue to function throughout the end of the century. And it prevents the use of some antiquated methods for stormwater calculation that were leading to some of the problems. Now, the flood hazard rule, it took the mapping that we used before. And if you remember earlier, I said that the mapping that we use and the regulatory flood elevation that we used up until 2 weeks ago was about 2 feet below what we saw with Ida. So we raised that by 2 feet. So every floodplain elevation in the entire state that we regulate to was raised 2 feet higher than it was before. So that means we're now at 3 feet above FEMA or 2 feet above a state map, whichever is higher. No, there's no other state that does FEMA +3. And if someone doesn't have a map or they think the map is wrong, they can calculate the floodplain. But if you calculate the floodplain and you do your computer modeling, you have to use it not based on 1999 data or today's data, but the year 2100 precipitation. And then finally, we ensure that, and this is a big piece of it too, that anytime that we issue a permit at the state, that it meets minimum federal standards. There was some disconnect between our state programs and the federal program, and the FEMA, met with us and worked with us to make sure that we were a compliant community. So that way the state can rest easy knowing that if there's a disaster that they'll have relief from the federal government and so on. So that was a big piece of this as well. So practically, what is the effect of this? Let's say you have a little neighborhood here with a stream going through it. And let's say that's the previous floodplain. It says current here, but let's say current as of 16 days ago. But then 2 weeks ago, we adopted this new elevation that was 2 feet higher. So let's say that you're that blue house. You didn't know that you were at risk, right? That red house is more at risk than they thought. And the blue house probably doesn't need flood insurance because, again, unless the lender requires it, and they're not going to require it if it's outside that line. So if someone were building this today, they'd have to make sure that the lowest floor was elevated properly. They couldn't have basements. If this was a multi-residence building, they'd have to have a means of getting in and out of the building. So it's a much higher bar that we've set. And for stormwater, one of the things that we were criticized for when we were contemplating this rule, because we talked about it a lot. We wanted the public to know what we were doing. And we had a lot of webinars and seminars that talked about what the pros and cons were of what we were doing, and how it would play out. People said, well, you're making us design stormwater systems for this flood that might never happen, and it's going to take up half the site. It's going to triple the size of these basins. So my colleague Mike Sheehan, who's on the call here tonight, he did some analyses of like sort of a worst case scenario. Excuse me. So let's say you had a 2.5 acre site up in Sussex County, because that's where we're going to see the most projected increase in rainfall in the state, as much as 50% in parts of Sussex. And let's say you were taking that forested site, that perfectly forested site, and you were cutting down every tree and you're putting a warehouse on it. So we wanted to see how much of the site would have to be dedicated to manage the runoff. So under the existing in the top left corner, which was the 1999 data, you can see based on the different soil types, soil A is the most permeable and D soil is the least permeable, that between 8 and 11% of the site, give or take, would have to be dedicated towards stormwater management. And there's a lot of assumptions that went into this. But what we did was we said, well, let's just keep everything the same and just turn the dial and say, well, what would happen if we used the 2019 rainfall data? How much bigger would that stormwater management system have to be? And you can see it's only marginally larger, maybe up to 0.4% larger in some cases. And then if you turn the dial to 2100, you can see that it increases by only as much as about 2.5% more than of the site more. So, we're talking between 8 and 11% of the site before, and now we're talking between 11 to 13% of the site. And you can sometimes do things to make your if you have above ground BMPs that they're deeper, there's a lot of factors there. So it might not even be this much. This is kind of like the worst case scenario. And if you have less intense development, then you'll see even less of an increase, right? Let's say that you have a 5-unit subdivision and you can see the existing amounts range between 4 and 5% of the site. It increases just marginally to the 2019 data, and the new future increases are only as much as about 2.1% more. So let's talk a little bit about how this applies. So if anyone's designing what we call a major development, right, which you're probably familiar with that term, it's any project has an acreage disturbance or has a 1/4 acre motor vehicle surface or impervious surface, you need to meet the stormwater management rules. And that's irrespective of whether or not you need a DEP permit or you're just going to your municipality. DEP only sees about 1/4 of the major developments in the state associated with the permits that we issue. The other 3/4 are administered locally. And the first question that we get asked is, well, how do I know this rule applies to me? So there are a couple off ramps for it. If you needed any one of these permits, flood hazard, wetlands, CAFRA, waterfront development, or highlands permit, and you had submitted a technically complete application for the project before the rule took effect 2 weeks ago, then the whole project is not subject to the new standards. It's subject to the standards that were in place at the time the application was made, because we can't retroactively apply standards to things that we received, right? It has to be technically complete application, which means it can't just be a couple pieces of paper stapled together and sent in. It's got to be all the pieces there so that we can review it as of the 17th. So there's one provision though, the application has to include a stormwater management review component. You could sometimes need one of these permits and not trigger stormwater management, especially under our wetlands rules, because of the way they're structured. And we're going to fix that, but you had to have had a stormwater component. So in other words, you had to have submitted to DEP the calculations so that we could begin our review. Now, we've been using the term legacy instead of grandfather. Grandfather and grandfathering has a very unsavory past from post-Civil War Reconstruction era. And so we're moving away from that term grandfather. You won't find it in any of our rules. So we're saying that a project that came in before that date is legacy, or it's a legacy project. And there are a lot of things that will not legacy a project. If someone asked for an applicability determination from the state in the past and said, do I need a permit? And we said, no, that's a snapshot in time. And that's changed now that our floodplains are bigger. Same thing if you got a verification of the flood hazard area. That was based on the conditions under the previous rules and don't reflect current rules. freshwater wetlands LOIs, applications that don't include a stormwater management review component, that don't trigger the major development threshold, applications that are not technically complete prior to the 17th. So if something's received on the 17th or later, either locally or by the state, then it's subject to these rules with a provision that I'll talk about with your municipal flood ordinance, stormwater ordinance. So if it's not a project that needs a DEP permit, and watershed land management is our program, it can be legacied if certain local approvals under the municipal land use law are obtained. And there's a list in the rules in section 1.6. And basically it says that if you've reached one of these milestones, preliminary site plan approval, final site plan approval, building permits, so on, then, and that happened before the rule change, then you are legacied. Now, this is what's interesting. Municipalities, if it's a project that doesn't need a state permit, municipalities have up to a year to amend their municipal stormwater ordinance, except when it comes to projects that are covered under the residential site improvement standards, because they point to our stormwater rules. So if you have a project that's subject to RSIS, it now today needs to meet these standards, assuming it was applied for after or received those approvals locally after July 17th, when the rule was adopted. If it's non-RSIS and it doesn't need a DEP permit, then that means it's not, these new standards, which are so important, are not going to kick in unless and until the municipality updates its stormwater ordinance. So please focus as much attention as you can on getting that done to protect your communities, and we will help you every step of the way. So it gets a little complicated, right? Because there's already some legacy provisions based on, projects that were received before we adopted green infrastructure requirements in 2021. So really there's 3 sets of stormwater management rules that someone could theoretically be subject to, and it's messy, and eventually this will go away. But you could have situations where a project is not subject to green infrastructure because it came in before March 2nd, 2021, or it came in after March 2nd, but before 2 weeks ago, and then it's subject to those rules. And then after July 17th, it's subject to the current rules. So the heart of the stormwater management rules, there's 2 tables. There's one table that shows the current precipitation adjustment factors. And what this does is that it adjusts the rainfall data that we got from the National Weather Service that everybody uses, that was last updated in 1999, and it adjusts it for the year 2019 conditions, which is when the study was done. And so you can see it's a relatively modest increase. I think the highest there is in Warren County is a 15% increase for the 100-year design storm, which is pretty significant since it was only 20 years. And then the second table is the future precipitation change factor. So this brings rainfall last updated in 1999 out to the year 2100. And you can see whether you're designing for a 2-year storm, a 10-year storm, or a 100-year storm, depending on which county you're in, these are your adjustment factors. So you take the rainfall data, multiply it by that, and then that's what you design your stormwater management system to. Groundwater recharge, obviously that needs to be based on there's different ways to design it, but if you're designing it based on the difference between pre and post construction runoff, you now have to calculate that using the projected 2100 2-year storm amounts. And there's now 6 storms that someone has to show us that the stormwater management system works for. The year 2019 precipitation for the 210 and 100 year, and the 2100 precipitation for the 210 and 100 year for existing and proposed conditions. And this is all necessary, as I've said before, to ensure that BMPs will continue to work, not just today, but for future conditions through the end of the century. Now, under flood hazard, unlike stormwater, where we only see a fraction of the major developments, we see all applications for activities in flood hazard areas at the state level. So all regulated activities in the old floodplain and in this new expanded floodplain are subject to the standards, except for 4 cases. And these are like legacy cases. One is if you, whoops, went too fast. So if you remember before, I showed you this is like the before and after of the floodplain, right? So that blue house might be covered, it might not be covered. So here's the first case. the activity, the thing, the house, the road, the outfall structure, whatever it is that's being built, is part of a project, an overall project that already has a valid flood hazard permit. So if someone came in for this 3-unit subdivision and only the red house was in the floodplain at the time, and they got a permit for us for the red house, we're not going to now go back and get a second bite of the apple and make them get a permit for the blue house, because they got a permit for everything that they needed at the time that the rules were in effect. So we could say that the blue house is legacied from the new rules. Now, if I were meeting the permittee and having a conversation with them, I would do what I could to try to convince them that raising the house 2 feet would be the safe and right thing to do, but we wouldn't be able to compel them to do that. So let's say that it's also part of a project that needs a permit and you submitted an application before July 17th. So before July 17th, you only needed a permit for that red house. After July 17th, you needed it for that blue house, but that's okay. You submitted an application before the rule changed. So again, the blue house is legacy. The third case is if you did not need a flood hazard permit for anything on your site, but now maybe part of your site's in the expanded floodplain. If you reached one of these 5 municipal approvals prior to July 17th, 2023, then you would also be legacied from the rule. And then finally, if you didn't need a local approval and you weren't in the floodplain before, like let's say you're DOT and you don't need a municipal approval, and you're now in this expanded floodplain, if you started construction on the activity before July 17th, then you're also legacy. But it's a very narrow definition because, for example, this house here, here's the old flood hazard area, here's the new flood hazard area. It's now in that expanded area. So unless some permanent construction was placed, and I won't bore you with reading this because you could read it to yourself, but basically what it's saying is that clearing a site or grading a site or cutting down trees does not constitute commencement of regulated activities. You have to do some permanent construction, like pouring a slab or a footing for a building or putting in piles or constructing columns, and so on. So and we've seen this happen now where people were outside the old floodplain, they have not commenced construction, they didn't have local approvals, they now need to meet these new standards. And that's appropriate because we now know that the floodplains that we had been regulating to for very long are not safe enough. Just a few more slides and then we can talk about all the many other things that we can talk about tonight. There's 6 methods in the flood hazard rules to determine what your flood elevation is based on the mapping sources. And real quickly, if you're using method 1, that's the state map. It's 2 feet above the flood that we mapped back in the 70s and 80s. The tidal flood elevation is not changing right now, but we have a rule proposal that will be rolling out in a couple months that applies sea level rise to our coastline. And just like this rule, which deals with precipitation driven flooding, that rule will deal with sea level rise driven flooding. And we're proposing to add 5 feet to the flood elevation along the ocean, and that be our regulatory flood. So that means buildings would have to be 5 feet higher than before. But that's not affected in this rule. And that won't take effect until sometime in 2024 when we adopt it. If you're using a FEMA map, then it's got to be 3 feet above the FEMA map. If you're calculating it for various reasons, like you're replacing a bridge or a culvert, then you have to calculate your flood and then add 2 feet to it. We have a way to approximate flooding in the state where there's no maps, and we've added 1 foot to those tables because we did an analysis about 15-20 years ago on all our flood maps, and we came up with a very conservative table that we know now is not necessary to add 2 feet to it. It was adding 1 foot is plenty conservative. And then if you're calculating it, which is what a lot of people will be doing, is you're not calculating it based on today's runoff or 1999's runoff. You're calculating it based on the future 2100-year precipitation, and then you're increasing that by 25%. So you figure out how much water is in the floodplain, add 25% to it for that future condition, and then that's what you model your floodplain. This picture here, I guess you can't answer the question. Well, I normally would ask the questions, where is this picture? I'll tell you. So this picture was taken in 1955, not by me, of the Delaware River in Phillipsburg. That's the Free Bridge in Phillipsburg. And the story goes that, and I talked to somebody that saw this happen, that there was a barn floating down the river. This is during Hurricane Diane in 55. And the barn had all these chickens on the roof, and the barn slammed into the bridge. All the kids ran down to watch it happen, and chickens went flying throughout Phillipsburg and Easton for days after the fact. So there's some anecdotes for you to get you on. Just a couple more slides. If a person has obtained a verification of the flood hazard area or one of those applicability determinations, it does not exempt a project from the new standards, because as I mentioned, they're just a snapshot in time. And just like freshwater wetlands letters of interpretation, site conditions change, right? It happens with LOIs where we had a resource classification of intermediate value, and then subsequent to the LOI, we found out that there was threatened endangered species habitat. And so that means it became an exceptional value wetlands and had a 150-foot transition area. So that's not uncommon for the state to have that happen. And if you had a verification, we're not going to revoke it, but we're going to say, if you're going to use that verification to design a project, you're going to have to design that project for the current rules. So you're going to have to be 2 feet higher than the elevations shown on that verification. And last slide before I turn it over to others. One of the big components, as I mentioned, was that there was some disconnect between the state program and the federal program. In 99% of the cases, our state program was equal to, and in most cases, well exceeded federal minimums. But there were some cases where we would issue hardship exceptions or variances where it would not be completely NFIP compliant. And that put local governments at a disadvantage, right? Because your local floodplain ordinance might say XYZ, and here the developer has this permit from the state of New Jersey saying, here's your flood hazard permit, it meets our state rules. Well, it meets the state rules, it must meet my local floodplain ordinance, but that's not true in every case. So we closed that loop with FEMA. And then, well, if there's any questions, Jen, I don't know if you want to do questions now, or if you want to wait till after.
Thanks, Vince. That was great. What we're going to do is we're going to move on to our next presentation, and then we'll come back and do Q&A. For those of you who are in the audience, we're now up to 82 people. If you hang with us, we're going to have a slightly longer program this evening. So we're going to go to until 8:30. We usually try to wrap up our programs in an hour, but because there's so much content tonight, we are going to go a full hour and a half. This session is being recorded. We will send it out to everyone. It will also be on YouTube. So you will have the information to go back and look at again. And we're going to do this whole show again at our Environmental Congress on October 13th. So if you go ahead and register for that, we'll be opening up registration soon. You can see this in person and have conversations with DEP staff. So we know this is a lot, and we're going to bring you as much information as many times as we can until you all have your answers. And so with that, Vince, thank you. That was really great. I appreciate it. I want to make sure that we move on to Kunal and speak about the National Flood Insurance Program. And we're putting these programs together tonight because it's important to recognize that what we're talking about in the flood hazard rules and the stormwater rules is future development. New Jersey is one of the 13 original colonies. We have an awful lot of old development, and we've got a lot of old development in our waterways. So there are a lot of buildings, a lot of homes that are at risk now and will be in the future. So it's important to talk about the National Flood Insurance Program as well in terms of those entities and those people who are at risk for flooding. So thank you so much, Kunal, for being with us tonight. Dr. Kunal Patel has 19 years of work experience with DEP. He has worked in programs for watershed management, stormwater management, dam safety, and flood engineering. He serves as the New Jersey State National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator. So we couldn't get anybody better to talk about this tonight. And he oversees several flood risk reduction projects in partnership with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and floodplain mapping activities in partnership with FEMA. He also manages the Rebuild by Design Hudson and Meadowlands projects. He received his doctoral degree from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Rutgers University and has worked as an adjunct professor at Rowan University and TCNJ. He is a professional engineer licensed in New Jersey and New York and a certified floodplain manager. So thank you, Kunal, for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. And so I will surrender it to you. You should be able to share your screen. If you can't, let me know and we'll fix the tech on that.
All right, sounds good. Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks,
you.
Vince.
Yep, it's coming in now.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
Teaching has allowed me to get used to all these technologies, you know, especially during COVID. I used a whole bunch of tools, Zoom, Adobe Connect, WebEx, you name it. Thanks everyone for joining tonight. I know it's late, but that's how we environmental commissioners work. I served on Edison Township for one term as an environmental commissioner, and I appreciate everybody's time and support for state of New Jersey's municipalities. So the National Flood Insurance Program was enacted in 1968. And the reason it was enacted was it was very difficult for people to get commercial flood insurance at the time. And as you can imagine, the reason was it was a risky asset to insure. And things have just gotten worse, like Vince demonstrated, right? We get more data, more information, and it shows that we are actually suffering more losses. In fact, NFIP was supposed to be self-sustaining based on the flood insurance premiums. And it was until 2005. And you could probably guess that was when Katrina occurred. And since then, NFIP has been in red. It's, as of last year, NFIP program owes US Treasury over $20 billion. So basically, it's subsidizing the premiums, the amount of premiums that it collects from businesses and homeowners. It's not sufficient to cover the payouts because of all the damages, Maria, Irma, Harvey, Ida, Sandy, right? You name it. There's so many storms throughout the nation. So why is this program running? Well, Congress wants to make sure that our businesses, our homeowners, residents, they are able to have affordable flood insurance. And back in 2012, Congress did try and directed FEMA to make their flood insurance premium more reflective of the actual risk. But then there were so many complaints throughout the nation that it would become almost unaffordable for many homeowners to have flood insurance. So then in 2014, they reformed it, and now we are on a glide path where we slowly increase the flood insurance premiums to get to the actuarial rates. So that's the background on the NFIP and the flood insurance side of things. Now, like Vince said, right, flooding is our #1 natural hazard in New Jersey. However, in federal government's eyes, this is a voluntary program, NFIP. Communities do not have to participate. There are no federal or state law requirements that requires the communities to join the National Flood Insurance Program. I always put it out first.
Cal, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if you could put your slides in presentation mode, then they would be bigger and we could read them a little bit.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep. Let me get this out. And then, oh, that's too small. I'm looking for that glass somewhere here.
Down on the bottom of your screen, there's a, yep, there you go.
Yep, there you go.
Perfect, thank you.
Still adjusting to my new glasses, but okay, got it. Is it good now, Jennifer?
Yeah, actually, we've got your, the next slide preview is showing now, so it's even smaller.
Oh boy, we try to improve things. All right, let's do it. I think I have two screens. That's the problem.
Well, if that's the best way, that's better than the previous version. Now it sounds like an eye exam here. Better this way or better that way? I think we can work with that.
Okay, sorry about that. Could try to make it a little bit bigger. How about that?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Yep, all right. So in federal government's eyes, the program is voluntary. Communities are required to do certain things if they decide to join the program. And I always mention this because sometimes municipal governments, they're not aware of the fact that this NFIP program, it's not an unfunded mandate that sometimes we hear. So we always clarify this first, that it's a voluntary program. Because we have so many hazards in the state of New Jersey, many municipal governments, almost all, I would say, have decided to join the program. In fact, there are 552 communities that participate in the NFIP program. And the participation in the program allows to buy the federal flood insurance, the more affordable premiums. Whenever you buy, sell home, if you are doing a transaction within the flood hazard area, then it is required to have the flood insurance. And having this NFIP participation allows businesses and residents to purchase the federal flood insurance. Another common misconception is that I don't need to have a flood insurance because if there's a disaster, government will provide the disaster assistance. Well, that's not true because, first of all, to get any federal relief, president has to declare that as a major disaster. If the declaration doesn't come through, then there is no federal assistance that will be afforded. Second thing, even in the case where there's a disaster declaration, the most common form of assistance is a loan, which we have to pay back. So disaster assistance is not the best alternative to your flood insurance. Therefore, we always encourage that buy flood insurance. Many homeowners are not aware that their flood insurance, the homeowner insurance will not pay for flood losses. So they have to have a separate flood insurance coverage. And like Vince explained in a good detail, like how if you are right next to the 100-year floodplain, if you're outside, doesn't necessarily mean that line's not going to move, the flood's going to stop at that line, right? In fact, we noticed in the recent events, the Henri and Ida, over a third of the claims were outside of the FEMA mapped 100-year floodplain. So we strongly encourage people to buy flood insurance and protect themselves. The amount of coverage that's available for residential is $250,000 for buildings, $100,000 for contents. And for commercial properties, it's up to $500,000 for buildings and $500,000 for contents. So to participate in the NFIP program, the requirement is that the community must adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations. And it also requires that each municipality, they designate a local floodplain administrator who is responsible to administer those ordinances. So these model ordinances, FEMA, after Hurricane Sandy, evaluated state of New Jersey's NFIP program in details and identified that there were several gaps that we need to fill in. And we came up with the ordinances, the model ordinances that covers many different jurisdictions that regulate floodplain management. NFIP is one. State of New Jersey through DEP flood hazard area rules regulates it. Building codes through UCC regulates the construction in that. ASCE 724. So there are a variety of requirements for construction and activities within the floodplain. What we have done is with FEMA, we worked out the model ordinances that satisfies the requirements of all these jurisdictions. And we have been sending out the letters to municipalities for the last 2 to 3 years now to have them update their ordinances for flood damage prevention. As of now, about half the municipalities in the state should have received a letter from DEP to update their ordinances for flood damage prevention. And there's still about half the municipalities we will reach out over the next few years to update those ordinances. So what changed? Before this final audit and the model ordinances, there used to be 6 different models in state of New Jersey. We simplified it to just 2 models, coastal and riverine. If you got any coastal flood hazard in the municipality, you adopt the coastal model. If not, then you do the riverine model. We simplified to just 2 instead of 6 that was there in the past. What changed? Some of the things that we identified and incorporated in the newer model ordinances is the penalties for violation of municipal ordinances, how to establish the flood elevations, certain types of structures, manufactured homes, RVs, some guidance was lacking, so we incorporated those requirements in there too. We also clarified that the floodplain administrators now can issue the notices or stop work order. They can require person to remedy the violation, give them a 30-day period to respond, and penalties are added in the ordinances. These floodplain administrators, typically they work in conjunctions with the construction officials, and we have seen in practice what happens now from learning from many floodplain administrators is that if there's a project in the floodplain, typically the construction official will send those projects to floodplain administrators for approval first. And until floodplain administrators give their approval, the clock will not start for the construction officials or zoning officials, because we realize there are some municipalities that they have a clock, they got to issue the permit within certain days. So this is the work flow that we have seen many municipalities adopt. The floodplain administrator, it could be your municipal engineer, it could be your construction official or any other municipal employee or engineering firm that the municipal government can also hire for assistance. Now, the ordinance adoption process, it's a complex flow. What we suggest is send it to DEP first before you, because FEMA will not approve it until it has the eyes from our office first, because we want to make sure that you adopt the ordinance that incorporates federal government's requirements, the state requirements, and then there's nothing that's added into it that doesn't meet the guidelines or federal requirements. So we review your draft ordinances in detail, and then we coordinate with FEMA to make sure that it gets approved. So first thing, if you get that letter, you will submit the draft to DEP. Now, some towns we have seen, they voluntarily want to go ahead and update their ordinances. They can do that. That's fine too. We will assist those municipalities to update their ordinances as well. I have a couple contacts here. You could reach out to get the guidance if you want to have your municipality update their flood damage prevention ordinances. We will be more than happy to assist. And Jennifer, that was my last slide. I think I'm good for any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Patel. I appreciate that. So what we'll do now is we'll have you stop sharing your screen, and we'll ask Vince if he will turn on his camera. And we have quite a few really good questions. So we are going to lightning round. I'm going to move from the top of the order to the bottom of the order and go back and forth a little bit so we get some questions going about the flood hazard rules as well as the National Flood Insurance Program. Anything that we aren't able to answer tonight, we will capture these questions, and putting you on the hot seat, Dr. Patel and Vince, if we can come back to you, and then we'll correspond directly with the people to the extent that we can. We've got a few anonymous in there, but we'll do our best to get all these questions answered. So with that said, let's start at the top of the order. And so this is for you, Vince. Jim asks, I understand climate modeling will employ more up-to-date information to determine floodplain boundaries. However, I've read that communities in the Highlands region where flood risk is reduced by elevation in some cases. Will these townships be held to the same requirements for the inland flood protection rules? So if you could talk a little bit about where we actually do have some elevation in New Jersey and how these rules affect them, that would be great.
Absolutely. And that's a great question because, you know, no two storms are created equal, and there's no two communities that are equal, right? There's all so many different variables that go into the topography and the soil types and the geology of an area. So the Highlands is lucky in the sense that because it has a lot of topography and relief, that there are high points that are not in flood zones, right? Because they're at the top of the hill instead of the bottom of the hill. But if you're along the bottom of the hill where the streams are, then the flooding will increase as much as anywhere else in the state. Actually, in the northwest part of the state is where we're seeing the greatest increases in precipitation intensity. So yes, it would affect that. And the same thing with stormwater management, right? We're projecting out to the year 2100 using the rainfall amounts. Water that falls in a Highlands community is going to end up going downstream out of the Highlands into some other community. And so people downstream are inheriting your stormwater if you're in the Highlands. And so, and that's the case with any headwater area. So it's critical that in headwater areas, as well as everywhere else, that we employ protective standards.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that answer. Let's go to flood insurance. I've got one for you, Kunal. This attendee asks, does a community need to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program for residents to purchase flood insurance or to receive discounted rates based on the level of mitigation or education?
So that's right. Municipality have to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Only then those residents in those communities are eligible to get the flood insurance. Basically, FEMA wanted some entity that has the authority to implement and enforce the ordinances. So municipal government has that. And if they adopt the ordinances and enforce them, then the residents becomes eligible to buy the flood insurance. Now, the discount parts is when the communities do more than the minimum federal requirements, then federal government starts giving the discounts on the flood insurance premiums. Starts out with the lowest amount is 5% discount on the premiums. We have some communities in New Jersey that get up to, I believe, 40% discount on their flood insurance premiums because they do so much more than the minimum federal requirements.
Right. And about how many communities in New Jersey did you say were enrolled?
552, that includes the NJSEA, so 551 municipal governments.
Okay, so the majority of New Jersey, because we have 565 communities. So
Right.
the question I'm going to get on email at follow-up is who's missing from that list. So I'll take that answer offline, and we can correspond about that, because I know there are going to be a couple of people who are interested in that question.
Okay.
Thank you. Vince, I'm gonna volley back to you, and we'll talk about flood rules. There was some mention, or you mentioned, dry access laws. And so are these for institutions that serve a certain percent of people? Thinking about how the IDD, the intellectually developmentally disabled community, and how many group living situations there are with small, less than 5 vulnerable populations.
Well, that's a great question. So the dry access requirements apply to any multi-residence building, which is 3 units or more. So a single family home and duplex by itself is not, but 3 units or more is. And it also applies to any building that we call a critical building. Critical building is any place where there's healthcare being offered, daycare, so a retirement home, hospitals, medical clinics, and so a home that would serve IDD individuals would certainly be covered by that. And so if one were being constructed today, there would have to be a demonstration by the applicant that people in that community could get out of the building during a flood, that there's a dry means of access, and that emergency vehicles could get to the building.
Great, thank you. I have a follow-up, which was actually a question of mine for you, Vince. Will the DEP model flood ordinance be revised to include the inland flood rules? And I will add to that the update in precipitation volumes for stormwater.
So there's two pieces to that, right? There's the floodplain ordinance part that that Canal was speaking about, and then there's the stormwater control ordinance that each community has as well. So Canal, correct me if I'm wrong, in any flood ordinance that was adopted about in the last 2 years, pretty much what it does is it just points to the flood hazard rules as they exist. So there's nothing that needs to be done in those communities because it already points to the flood hazard rules as amended and supplemented.
Right, you're right. So any community that adopted the ordinances since 2020, they are good to go. They don't need to make changes. There is the guidance document that goes with these ordinances that will change, and we are in the process of updating that guidance documents, and we should have that in like next couple of weeks, and then we'll post it on our website. So ordinances, if they adopted in the last 3 years, they're good to go. The guidance document that goes with those ordinances, that would change.
Now, the stormwater control ordinances, it depends how they're worded too, because if I'm not sure if they often say 7:8 as amended and supplemented, or if it just points to a point in time. I think most of them point to a point in time. And so those would have to all be amended by the municipalities, and they have a year to do that. And so that would have to incorporate all the new precipitation, everything that the stormwater rules include now.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Vince, and I want to underscore that because we've got another question about ordinances that I think your answer addresses. For the environmental commissioners out there or municipal officials, you do need to look at your ordinance and how it's written. So if it has a reference to 7:8, 7:13, those are the statutory references for stormwater and for flood hazard. And so if it has that reference, then the ordinance gets automatically updated. If it doesn't have that reference and it talks about more specifics, then you've got a bit of an issue and your ordinance needs to be updated. Vince, is there anything you wanted to add to that, or did I get that mostly right?
You got it.
Awesome.
You're hired.
And so, I don't know about that.
You're natural.
So what we'll do is Jack will work with the DEP, and we will develop some language that you can use to look specifically at your ordinance. We're going to be talking about this a lot. Municipalities do have a year to update their ordinance for non-residential projects. Of course, I would love to encourage environmental commissioners to nudge their municipal officials to adopt this as soon as legally possible to get this adopted, because that's going to provide you the best protections. Okay, we've got some questions for the engineers in the audience because we've got a few of those here. So Elizabeth asks, and I think this is for you again, Vince, what calculation formulas may be used if the rational and modified rational methods cannot be used? So I know we're speaking a little bit of Greek to those of us who are not engineers. So we're talking about calculating volumes right now, right?
Absolutely. So if you think about the different methodologies out there for computing runoff from a site, generally we use the NRCS method. TR55 used to be called, and that includes all the different factors that are appropriate for estimating runoff. If you're just designing pipe capacity, then that's fine. Like if you're trying to figure out how much water a 36-inch PVC pipe CMP or whatever pipe would be able to carry, then you can obviously use the rational method for that. But if you're computing runoff from a site, then it would generally be the NRCS method.
Great, thank you. And Elizabeth follows up with another question asking, and I don't know the answer to this, what are you doing about the PA1 exception? So we're talking about planning area 1. So that brings into context or into the conversation the state plan.
So there's so what I think you're speaking about is that if you're in an urban redevelopment area, which includes developed portions of planning area 1, then you're not subject currently to the groundwater recharge requirements. And so there's been some discussion, and we stakeholder this to say, well, shouldn't everybody be treated the same in the state? I support that. We'll see what the final rule comes out in a couple months, what that includes. But we did stakeholder that, and I think it is appropriate. Now, obviously, if you have soils that you can't infiltrate in, like a D soil, or if it's contaminated, sometimes in planning area 1, you've got development on top of a landfill that's been capped. Like, obviously, we're not going to seek to have a recharge in a place like that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a question that brings into conversation something that we didn't talk about tonight, but we have talked about previously, and we're going to keep talking about. That's the MS4 permit, so the municipal separate storm sewer permit. Lots of things to talk about with stormwater and flooding, and I know this gets really complicated, but Dennis asks, should stormwater system outfalls to streams have mandatory municipal inspection to prevent blockages? And so there are some inspection requirements coming with the implementation of the MS4 permit. But that, I think, has to focus more on the actual systems. I'm not sure about the outfalls, or if you've got that answer, Vince.
Well, the outfalls, are being that they're part of the system, would be subject to the same standards as the rest of the system. I'm not sure whether a municipality is going to be required to inspect private discharges. I think that might be what's implied in the question. I think it's mostly going to be here's the stormwater management systems that are under the control of the municipality, and so there's a responsibility there to make sure they're in good working order.
Thank you. Here's a question for both of you. Will the inland flood hazard protection rule changes impact the National Flood Insurance Program or other flood insurance rates and risk factors?
Dr. Patel.
Absolutely. The FEMA is under the process of modifying how they calculate the flood insurance premium. If you want to Google it, it's called a risk rating 2.0. Basically, FEMA used the same method for over 50 years, and Congress realized it's not a workable solution. So FEMA has adopted a new method now that does not necessarily put much weight on the zone, like whether you are in the flood zone or not. That has a less weight compared to the actual elevation of your home compared to the water elevation. So FEMA has changed their methodology, and the inland flood protection rule will get you 3 feet above the base flood elevation. That would substantially reduce your flood insurance premiums. Big decrease in the flood insurance premiums with the new rules.
And since the risk rating, whether it's today or in the future, is based on the current mapping, right, canal, then whether this, even though the state's added 3 feet to it, that doesn't change like who needs flood insurance, right? Because they're still going to be using the flood insurance rate maps to figure out like who needs insurance and what the rate is.
Absolutely correct. So right, you're absolutely right, Wayne. So the new rules expanded the floodplain zones, but flood insurance requirements are not mandated by federal government. Federal government only looks at FEMA maps. So we, as the state of New Jersey, became proactive and expanded the flood zones, but in federal government's eye, they are still only going to require flood insurance in those 100-year floodplain boundaries. If somebody wants the mortgage, if they have completely paid off, then there's no one mandating it. I mean, not a good idea not to have it, but.
Great, thank you. Kathleen asks, how will and can the DEP help a municipality amend their stormwater ordinance? I think we talked a little bit about that. I mean, ANJAC would love to work with DEP to get out the model language. We've already talked a little bit about developing a chart. because we've talked about inland flood protection. We've talked about MS4 a little bit by reference tonight. We've talked about the National Flood Insurance Program. So there's lots of things. So a little bit of a flow chart and some model language. We would like to work with you to get that out. And I see nodding heads and nobody's exploding. So I would say that's how we're gonna work on that. If you've got anything to add to that, Vince or
No,
Dr.
that's exactly what I would say. Yeah.
I know we're coming up quickly on time here, but I do want to ask at least two final questions. Maybe we'll sneak in three, but we've talked about lots of help, lots of assistance, because that's what we want. We want compliance, right? Rules, regulations, laws are only as good as they are enacted. And so let's ask the big heavy question: what happens to communities that do not comply with the new requirements?
So a community that does not comply, if they are approving projects that don't meet the new standards, then there could be enforcement action against the community, and there certainly would be enforcement action against the individuals that are building, because it's incumbent on developers to make sure that they're meeting all the regulations. And so just because they're meeting a local rule that might differ from the state doesn't mean that they're not off the hook for meeting the state rules.
Great, thank you. Let's ask, Faith wants to know, are there any rules or benefits to large riparian buffers? So stream corridors, riparian buffers means the same thing in these rules. And the idea is to keep new homes out of floodplains versus just raising them up.
Right. So, it's an interesting and difficult balance, right? So we do have our riparian zones, which are 50, 150, and 300 feet from the top of bank, depending on the resource classification of the water. And they're not no build zones, but they're very much limited in what you can do. And it's interesting because every time that I start writing a rule that looks like it might result in a regulatory takings, then our attorneys remind me that we can't have that. And so there's got to be some kind of reasonable use under our statutes. So if someone wanted to build a multi-residence building, let's say, and it didn't have dry access, we could say no to that building, but we couldn't prevent them from maybe building a single family home. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have the standards, the same standards for that, because there's got to be some kind of use that we are permitting on the site. Now, I love riparian zones and want them to be bigger. And I think that, riparian zones in conjunction with flood hazard areas, it preserves the flood carrying capacity of streams and rivers. It preserves vegetation in that area, so it improves water quality, provides habitat. So there's nothing in the state rules that say that a community can't adopt bigger riparian zones than the state has. So even if we have a 300-foot along a category 1 water, there's nothing that says that the community couldn't adopt a more protective standard.
All right, thanks, Vince. I'm going to do two more quick questions and then we're going to call it a night. This is from Amy, and I believe this is for Kunal. Can someone voluntarily obtain federal flood insurance if they're in the NJDEP regulated flood hazard area, but outside of the FEMA floodplain?
That's a very good question. And we have heard so many times that homeowners, they've been told by people that they can't buy flood insurance because they are not in the FEMA flood zones. That is the incorrect statement. Anyone can buy the flood insurance as long as their municipality is participating in an FIP. And in fact, we encourage them to buy the flood insurance because if you're outside the FEMA flood zones, chances are the premiums are going to be a lot lower, in the order of a few hundreds instead of a few $1,000s.
Great, thank you. That's a good answer. And so the final question, and I'm going to weigh in on this as well with you, that we're going to take tonight, and we'll do our best to get back to the other questions. We'll capture those and correspond with you offline. But this final question this evening is from Kate. The presentation so far seems to focus on new builds. What about existing builds in vulnerable communities. Also, a follow-up related question is cost. Flood insurance can be so expensive that it truly does become the pejorative of only those who can afford it. Building to increase standards can increase costs. How can municipalities reconcile these increased costs with the need for future resiliency? I want to say yes, amen, 100%, you are right. These are huge problems, and we are talking about building for the future with these regulations. One of the things that we fully recognize in putting these rules forward, putting this presentation forward, is that New Jersey is an old state. We have a lot of old development, and we have a lot of people who are in vulnerable situations, many of whom are in low income, English as second language speaking Black and brown communities who cannot afford to necessarily move out and don't want to necessarily move out because these are their homes. They've been there for generations. So there are other tools that ANJAC and other nonprofits and the state of New Jersey are encouraging and supporting municipalities with grant money, one-on-one assistance, resource materials. Top of mind are stormwater utilities. We have to do better for the future, but we also have to address the problems that we have created in the past that are coming to bite us now. And so stormwater utilities create an equitable, sustainable financial solution for addressing those issues by holding those who are most accountable or most responsible for generating stormwater runoff that's unmanaged at this time. Because again, we got old development that predates regulations, holding them responsible for managing their stormwater so that you who are living in the floodplain start to receive less of that impact. Absolutely, this is a complicated problem, and what we're talking about tonight is just one part of the solution. Vince, Kunal, if you want to add anything to that.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely, you covered, Jennifer. The flood insurance, definitely it has been bought by many communities in the DC, and FEMA has considered several options like, buy flood insurance and consider the premiums based on the economics of the person buying the flood insurance. Other option that was floated was the municipality buys the flood insurance for the whole municipality instead of individual person. But these are all in considerations, but nothing has materialized. These are suggestions from some of the national associations on, but you are absolutely right. The risks are increasing, premiums are increasing. Like I said, it's in debt for the last since 2005. So it's a legit concern.
Yeah, and absolutely. And one thing that I can add to that too, it's interesting. After Sandy, after Superstorm Sandy, we adopted advisory flood mapping along the coast that bumped up the flood elevation because of all the people that were rebuilding. We wanted to make sure they rebuilt to the best available data. And one of the criticisms that we got immediately was, well, it's going to cost a lot more for people to rebuild higher. And what we found is that if you were going to elevate a house anyway, then elevating it a little more costs almost nothing. And if you were building it new, depending on the type of foundation, the cost increase for every foot you go would be about 0.5% or 1% for the cost of the building. But the higher you go, the less your flood insurance rate was. So every single time that we analyzed it, within 4 to 6 years, the added cost upfront of building higher was recouped in just reductions in flood insurance for that structure. And then the entire lifetime of that structure has lower flood insurance and is safer. So we couldn't find any downside to making people build higher, except that there were upfront costs that developers might have to foot and then pass along to their to the folks that use the buildings. But again, the folks that use the buildings are going to get flood insurance if they're in a special flood hazard area, and they'll save money.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to thank everybody who stayed with us through our little bit of a longer program tonight. We know this is complicated. There are lots of tools out there and tools that have not yet been implemented coming in the MS4 permit compliance for January, these brand new inland flood hazard rules and updated precipitation volumes for stormwater that were just adopted 2 weeks and a day ago, the new National Flood Insurance Program. We just talked about stormwater utilities. No one has yet to adopt them, but there are a couple of municipalities that are getting really close. There's no one silver bullet here, but there are lots of tools that we can implement to start to eke along to improve our flooding conditions here in New Jersey. We're going to be with you, you know, for as long as this takes to help remedy these issues that we have created from climate change and from our patterns of development. I can't thank enough Vince and Kunal and Michael for being here tonight, for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We look forward to doing this again at our Environmental Congress on October 13th. And thank you, Liz and Sheila, for helping to coordinate this program tonight. I wish you all a very good evening. We have a super moon tonight, so go outside and check it out. It's the closest that Earth is ever to the moon, so that's a little bit of a natural, not quite history, but whatever you want to call that. So go check it out. Check out the moon, and we'll all see you again very soon. And I know you're going to flood us with lots of questions. Please do, because we're here to make sure these rules get implemented in ways that save lives and protect our environment. So have a good evening. Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.